Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today we are going to be exploring the Just Plain Chaos role-playing game rules. As a means of introducing some of the concepts that I wanted to introduce to this podcast, I wanted to give some background associated with what Just Plain Chaos is about, also how I play the game, and also talk a little bit about narrative and setting, because I think these are two very important things which are oftentimes overlooked, particularly when you're dealing with existing historical stuff or things where you'd assume people would be familiar with the setting. I think setting is incredibly important in games in general. I come from a background of doing standard, deep games master kind of techniques associated with setting an environment, answering questions, doing all the usual things to make the players feel like they're participating in a world that is coherent and rich. And in particular, when you're dealing with stuff that most people don't typically know about. For example, currently there's a range of figures associated with the first Chechen Wars, which is something that fascinates me because I lived in Malaysia at the time, and the New Straits Times, which is the English publication in Malaysia, covered the Chechen rebels very, very thoroughly because obviously they were Muslims and a bunch of other things. But it gave a very pro-Chechen rebels account of the first Chechen Wars, and this is a historical period which absolutely fascinates me. So when A Range came out through Tiny Terrain in the UK, I backed their Kickstarter and I bought some of the models out of the Kickstarter because I just liked the first Chechen Wars. But no one in the general population is going to know anything about the first Chechen Wars. It's not something that people are familiar with. Even talking with some of the miniature painters that I work with on a regular basis, I was saying, prepare yourselves because these Chechen War figures are going to be coming. And we had a discussion. I had a discussion with one of the painters associated with the role that kind of haphazard uniforms had on the Chechen fighters. A lot of the stuff that you see online are photos actually from the latter part of the first Chechen Wars or the second Chechen Wars, where the uniforms were considerably more uniform, for want of a better term. Actually, what's fascinating through the early period is that they were just coupling together stuff that you would probably get at a military surplus store here. I mean, really just a bunch of different uniforms from all over the world kind of cobbled together, primarily because these fighters were fighting in dense, thick forests, basically, and cityscapes. So towns, cities, and thick forests were the typical points of conflict areas in the first Chechen War. So giving a narrative, giving some background, giving an explanation to what the setting is for the game that you're playing, I think is really very important. And with Just Plain Chaos, it's set in a near-future post-apocalyptic world. It's based loosely on some of my writing. It's based loosely on a variety of settings, some of which I published, some of which I haven't published. So giving the setting to folks is really important. And when I decided to run this at work, I had historically run about 18 months worth of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons with my co-workers. So they're already familiar with my general play style, my general narrative style. And the other thing is I run these after a regular day of work. So I'm typically quite tired through this experience as well. So when I ran D&D, I found that it was best run on a Tuesday night. I was best rested, best placed to actually do the game on a Tuesday night. And when I ran the game on a Wednesday night or a Thursday night, a lot of the mathematics that I like to keep in my head, I just couldn't keep up with that. It wasn't happening because I was just absolutely, I was just shocked basically by the end of the week. And there was no point in running a detailed game. So when I stopped running D&D, it was primarily because the characters had just gone to, the next stage was have them fighting demigods on some astral plane somewhere. I mean, we'd been playing for 18 months. The characters had leveled up fully. Everyone knew their battle styles. Everyone knew their strengths and their weaknesses. It wasn't really role-playing anymore. It was just kind of mechanics. So I took about 6 months off, and the choice to restart the gaming session came to me really when I was in New Zealand. And in parallel to this, I was also discovering Victoria Miniature's line of what would be used, I guess, as 40k Imperial Guard of a wide variety of different flavors, but are just really beautifully sculpted figures. Victoria Lamb was an early Gold Demon winner. She's based out of Adelaide, South Australia, which is the town I was born in, or the city as it is now that I was born in. And I have a really strong affinity for a lot of the aspects of the Victoria miniatures. The sculpting is just amazing. So I found this miniature line, and I thought, okay, So I've got this narrative associated with my historical writing. I found this miniature line that fits together with this thing. This would make a really interesting skirmish game. And I had some existing rule sets. Now, I've talked a little bit about this previously, but I've written rules at various times in my life and various places. And one of the rule sets that continued on with this, I thought would be really interesting to run as the role-playing game rule set. And the rule set is more wargaming oriented than it is role-playing game. There's a really interesting three-dimensional possibility of diagrams with regards to how these games are played. And the purists, dice and paper, no miniatures, narrative, even some of the games are less dice and paper, and you can just have straight narrative role-playing games. So that's kind of one extreme of purism. Another extreme is everything is visually represented. Everything's represented with miniatures. You actually construct the dungeon physically. You show the players every aspect of the game, and they're just basically moving around miniatures and acting out small aspects of roles. And then you have more what I would consider wargaming aspects, which are associated with, line of sight, certainly when you get to more kind of projectile stuff. And it's a very different dynamic. So I wanted some solid wargaming elements when playing Chaos. And I also wanted to have miniatures as a means of just visually representing what was going on. I also found the scenery company that did kind of post-apocalyptic, bombed out, could be Second World War, could be near-term dark future scenery, and bought a bunch of their kind of distracted, I don't know what one would call it, distracted cityscape stuff. So I had a few bits and pieces to use that. I had a bunch of old Dwarven Forge stuff that I'd used for the role-playing game aspect, so I could do like basic, cityscape roads and town, bollards and all the stuff that you get in cities. So I had a bunch of bits and pieces that I could put together for this game. But the most important thing for me initially was the narrative, and I'm including the PDF of Just Plain Chaos role-playing game rules. I've got to say, this is a really rough set of rules, and I'm providing it for this podcast to actually give a talking point associated with perhaps how rough you can go, but also just what you need to do if you yourself are running a scenario, not, selling it to other people, not even passing it on to other people for them to play. If you're the primary person that's running this and you just want a rule set that you can point to, that's really where the Just Plain Chaos role-playing game rule set is. But I wanted to provide it because I wanted to talk about my thinking associated with the narrative and the mathematics, and I thought that would be an interesting thing to start this podcast out with. So the first thing that I included with the Just Plain Chaos rules is a series of discussions associated with house rules, what the role-playing game is, and also how to resolve disputes. Now, thankfully, really thankfully, disputes very rarely occur. The way that I play these games, particularly at work, is associated with maintaining and maximizing the narrative. I don't want to kill off characters. I don't want circumstances where the jeopardy is very real and very stressful. I want a kind of narrative game which involves, some people being shot down, some people, various heroic moves, various headshots, this kind of stuff in the gameplay. But I don't want anything that's too stressful. I don't want a situation where characters are killed instantly. And certainly a lot of the stuff that I do through these rule sets is about exploring narrative, which is why I thought it was important to actually record a podcast initially associated with narrative. So the narrative setting that I presented to the characters occurs associated with the historical timeline and just getting a sense of what happened when and what is going on at any particular time. So the historical narrative is called History in the PDF document, and it just details what occurs to create this post-apocalyptic world, but framing it in a kind of divergence from our current, the early 1990s, actually. So diverging from the early 1990s with the technology as it was in the early 1990s, and also talking about concepts like what weapons bans do to society. There's an underlying political narrative element because this environment was very heavily based on my experiences in Australia. And in Australia in the early 1990s, the movement, or really the mid-90s, the movement was to reduce what firearms were in society, to reduce them down to very limited shot weapons, but also to demilitarize the society in a very well-impacted way. But what actually happened through this period, which is what's particularly fascinating, is that a good number of folks stockpiled weapons through this period of time as well. So I wanted to capture something which people in the US aren't very familiar with, because, I mean, obviously there have been various weapons bans here, but still the weapons are pretty omnipresent. Whereas in Australia, the people that wanted to hoard weapons, they hid weapons, they did a variety of different things. But in general, the society operated with kind of new standards in what firearms were. And in Just Plain Chaos, that has been enacted even greater, because the society, everyone, including the military, are forced into these new, weapons methods. So relatively low numbers of shot, single caliber weapons across all possible ranges, just a wide variety of things, of kind of combination of ban and militarization in parallel, which creates an interesting kind of counter-narrative. What you get through this as well is a social narrative associated with ruling elites. So the players, as they play it, are basically disenfranchised factory workers that are being further and further kind of concatenated into slave labor camps because of a variety of different factors, and the elites are just becoming more and more paranoid against the potential for armed revolt and this kind of stuff, which is what the game is actually about. So what I wanted to construct is some societal, elements to this thing. Also the notion of armed humans versus unarmed humans, which comes up through the general gameplay, and a notion of a ruling elite that's willing to cannibalize its own population. The whole notion of almost like a civil war, where a ruling elite will enact really draconian measures and actually cripple and kind of roboticize elements of the humans that are, left over in the lower, the lower society, so to speak. So what I did with this was I created a history which described as in the document from the early 1990s to the mid-2010s, and then I circulated that. So 2 weeks before the game started, I just presented this timeline narrative in just printed out bits of paper that I just handed the players, so they could get their own mentality into, oh, what is this? This isn't Dungeons and Dragons. This is something new. This is something that we're going to have to, look into and think about. And all these kind of constraints, I think, kind of fit the theme. And in parallel to this, I got them the Victorian miniatures, and I'd also sent them to a painter who had done a really amazing job creating very dark, apocalyptic elements to the figures. It was obviously taking the original Victorian miniature sculpts, but then just creating something that was very visually attractive and also got a sense of the players, that they were playing characters within something that was, very well defined. And I'm not a particularly good scenery painter, and as I've noted, I farm my miniatures out for commission painting because I'm not a very good miniature painter. But I wanted to create this overarching narrative where immediately coming to this, from working at Netflix, these people were immediately transported into the environment. They immediately felt the repression. They immediately had a series of questions. I mean, the beautiful thing about controlled narrative is you can actually frame new discoveries and a variety of new things in the environment through the way that you construct the narrative. And certainly the characters in this game were very much downtrodden, not getting the right amount of information. The actual playing of the game creates a discovery element to finding out things about the world that they're in. And that, I think, over time has a really powerful effect on people that are playing these games. They feel very immersed in it. They get a sense that they're actively trying to work their way through this thing. It changes the mentality very quickly in a variety of players who had historically played, leveled up D&D characters. They were very, in that power character kind of narrative, and now coming up from the bottom with limited weapons, with a bunch of crazy additional stuff. And that, I think, was very important with regards to framing Just Plain Chaos as a game. I wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of kind of career paths and how that was described through the use of skills in the game. And as you'll note through the PDF, the skills are they're just literally single-line descriptions. There's no greater detail. There's no notion of this. But by describing to the players early on that you've got this dice rolling mechanic that I'll talk about in another recording. But from that, you get a list of regular intelligence, irregular intelligence, appearance, physical health, and mental health. These are the statistics that come through the game. And these are the important statistics that are used through the game. And from that, based on the number that you have for each of these statistics, you can pick that number of skills in those particular areas. And the skills are grouped in those groups But some skills, more advanced skills, require you to have other skills in other areas, which means you need to strategically work out what kind of character you want and work out the skill paths through that. And that was a very important dynamic for me, which really comes from the Simbita rule sets. I mean, certainly, I remember when I played the Robotech game initially, and then other of the Simbita rule sets, was very important to me that these notions, and to a lesser extent, this was in the old Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game as well. In fact, really, in Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game, it was a smaller number of skills, but very much the notion of being on a skill path. And this is a dynamic that I really like, because what I'm trying to create here is no all-powerful characters. What I'm trying to create here is characters that have implicit weaknesses, but implicit strengths based on the decisions that they've made. And I think the difficulty that I found playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons was a lot of characters worked out, well, a lot of players worked out how their characters could become super characters and have these dynamics which really define them as characters and completely eliminated the role-playing element. And I think what fascinates me with these kind of interdependent skills and limiting what is available to any potential player is that they're forced to think about what they want the character to actually be. And that is a very important dynamic because it creates a different kind of play style, and the ability to slowly move through skill sets, to slowly, level up and rejoin and get a bunch of different things working together, I think is a very important game dynamic that I certainly wanted. And I generally, historically, if I look at the rules that I've written, this has been a dynamic that I've used about 2/3 of the time, because I think it's really very powerful in creating more playable characters fundamentally, and also creating a circumstance where the games don't get boring. One of the problems you have if characters can maximize in all skills very rapidly in all areas is they're just, they're like Swiss Army knife characters, right? Whereas what you want is a series of gameplay dynamics, which are important because you'll have one character that's specialized in one thing, one that's specialized in another thing. You'll have generalist characters, and you'll have circumstances through the gameplay where one of those characters is knocked out, or one of those characters is incapacitated, or something goes wrong with one of those characters' ability, or multiple of the characters. I mean, particularly at the tougher points in a role-playing game, you've got a circumstance where a majority of the characters may actually be playing really suboptimally for a variety of different reasons. And that is a very interesting dynamic, which I like, personally, more the dice to do. Occasionally you can do it through narrative, but it's really important to maintain this notion that collaborative play is actually what creates the games in a kind of whole form. And if you have characters that are just like super characters all over and can do the whole thing solo, that's a different game. So certainly the dynamic associated with how the various skill sets fitted together was important for me in creating characters. And in the Just Plain Chaos rules, the selection of weapons also creates that. So there's a submachine gun weapon, there's a rifle weapon, there's a sniper rifle weapon. Historically, I had other kinds of weapons in there as well. I had assault rifles. I've returned to allowing for, pistol and revolver-like weapons, although they play with slightly different rules. And I'm going to talk more about the actual dice rolling and the elements to these things further in these podcast recordings. But I just wanted to put it there that the limiting aspect of creating characters is something that I use, as I've said, quite a lot in the games that I create. But it is your choice associated with how you frame these rules, particularly in a role-playing game. Also, strangely enough, through war games and board games, too. How you frame how much power individual characters have and how they need to use this power strategically in the game. And I think this is probably a good place to stop this recording. I did want to say one final thing. My Rules Are Better, the podcast, gets out there because of word of mouth. And as a listener, you have an important responsibility, if you like this podcast, to tell other people about this podcast through any way you see fit, either by word of mouth, either through social media, wide variety of different ways that you can get the message out about this podcast. But this podcast is here primarily to see, is this a podcast people want to listen to? Is this something that people are going to get benefit from in the long term? But I wanted to provide the podcast to the community with the view that if you like this podcast, it will continue on. And a way to show that to me is to introduce this podcast to someone else. If you like it, do that. And that'll be a wonderful way to continue the podcast. If you'd like to contact me, The way to do that is through my regular email address, which is Barbalet, my surname, Bravo Alpha Romeo, Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango @gmail.com. I look forward to hearing correspondence. I will dedicate podcasts to talking about the correspondence that I receive as well. So if you don't hear your name shouted out initially and you've sent an email to me, it will be coming up. I will probably do them in groups of podcasts, which I'll just do as like listener emails or something like that in order to give that feedback in that kind of time frame. So lots more to cover with regards to the Just Playing Chaos rules. We're just getting started, but I wanted to record a little bit associated with narrative and these kind of framing elements, and then we'll get into dice dynamics and other exciting things like that. Tom Barbalet coming to you from San Jose, California, signing out.